Make me feel special.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. Dan Slott on Amazing Spider-Man has been a fairly, I would say, a lightning rod of a creator. People either remember his run very fondly or they hate him and they think he can't do anything right and he's terrible for sales. It's very, there's very little kind of in the middle, it's fine kind of views. It's very polarized with Dan Slott. And I think there's a lot of things that are going on outside of the comics that are leading to that, either just various statements that have been made on social media, or he was actually a very active participant in a message board back in the day, and that caused a lot of kind of shenanigans and other things. So many people kind of forget about the comics he did. So how well did he sell? We've heard comments, including that Disney documentary, that said he was one of the top selling creators and can really claim to be a pretty significant player in all this. So is that true? Well, let's take a look at it. Dan Slott, and keep in mind, for the purposes of this conversation, because this one wound up being a lot more work than I originally intended. We're looking at his run where it's not interrupted by other creators. It's a solid run for him. So he did co-write several Spider-Man books, and during his run, he had various spin-offs that he worked with other people on. So for the purpose of this, and you'll see why in a moment, we're going to focus on his quote-unquote mainline run, 152 comics, really ranging between November of 2010 through June of 2018. And so it's going to keep it a lot more sane to kind of look at those numbers. But we will see some stuff before and after. So for the purposes of this, like I mentioned, here's what we're looking at. Amazing Spider-Man in November of 2010, he came on as kind of the solo writer. Previous to this, in the Brand New Day storyline, this is following the Spider-Man's marriage getting erased by Mephisto, and a number of writers were on the book. But he took the sole reins on issue 648. He went 53 issues, a shocking amount of comics without relaunching. And then the title did relaunch with the Superior Spider-Man story. This is where Doc Ock took over. This was in January 2013. And then in April 2014, just a little over a year later, the title was relaunched. It would go 18 issues, and then it would get interrupted by Secret Wars and relaunched again a year later in 2015. Now, you may notice, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot more comics in these runs than years. Well, that's because they were double shipping the hell out of this comic. It was typically not uncommon for 2 issues, and in a couple of cases, even 3 issues to go out in a month, but it was generally shipping twice monthly. So that's important as we go along with this. So let's take a look at this graph of Dan Slott. And I know a lot of people who despise Dan Slott are really like, it's going to crater. Well, here's your picture. And it's a lot of data, so this starts to look like kind of a crazy picture. It looks like an EKG with a couple super high blimps, including like one really massive one, or 2 really, that are super significant here. But this starts to be a little bit of an insane picture to look at. So we're going to break this up in a couple different ways. This is, like I mentioned, going to be kind of a different numbers video from what I normally do, simply because there's a lot of data to go over, and the story that the data tells is a lot more confusing than with other runs, and I'll explain a little bit why. But for visualization's sake, here's where these reboots landed in terms of the runs. And you can see kind of here with these images, 4 relaunches over this course, or not, well, 3 relaunches, 1 takeover. Of course, at the end of this run, Nick Spencer would come on. We'll cover that in a moment and reboot the book again. But here's basically what it looks like from a timeline perspective. And if we look at the launch issues for each of these reboots, we see when he came on and he was officially the guy in this issue 648, it sold 77,000 copies. When he relaunched it as Superior Spider-Man, it launched at 188,000. And then, and we'll get more to it later, in just a staggering, huge issue, this number 1, Peter Parker Returns, Back from the Dead, 532,000. More than 500,000 copies get sold to that issue. And again, we'll talk more about that later, but there was not crazy shenanigans with this comic, meaning, there was tons of, when I say shenanigans, there were absolutely a million variant covers or some incentive programs, all that stuff for sure. And I would call that a shenanigan. But what I'm saying, it wasn't tucked into loot crates or these other things that other titles have done. And then this Amazing Spider-Man finally, number one after Secret Wars, it relaunched at 203,000 copies. So just off the bat, these are good numbers. These you can't deny him that. So let's look. It's over 152 copies, and in just under 8 years, Dan Slott had 15 issues that exceeded 120,000 copies sold. Now, this is a unique accomplishment for Marvel, and it's unusual for non-event comics. So meaning comics that aren't like Civil War or titles like that. It's impressive. Now, granted, number one issues with variants and everything else, it's not uncommon for them to exceed 120,000 copies. Not at all. But still, that's why I showed that picture. You had 3 number one issues in that course. You had 15 comics that did better than 120,000. So that's not bad. For reference, just for what it's worth, to give you a bigger sense of the time period, this does exceed numbers from Jason Aaron, Brian Michael Bendis, Tom King, Donny Cates, and Kelly Sue DeConnick in terms of ongoing titles. Now, obviously, Bendis has been attached to events, and he sold well. So is Donny Cates. So is Jason Aaron, Tom King as well with the Batman launch and everything else. So they've all had their kind of special things. Bendis has put up higher numbers than this for events. Absolutely. But for an ongoing title, I mean, if you can call it ongoing with 3 relaunches, for an ongoing title, this is still an impressive number. Titles that did better, that are ongoing books in this time period, were The Walking Dead and Scott Snyder's Batman. That was about it in terms of spiking issues that exceeded 120,000 copies. Now, as an aside, by the way, I know this is about Dan Slott. This does paint an interesting picture of what's happened to the industry over the last 15 years. Namely, it's become very addicted to events. The events easily exceed this. Most of them did. Many, from Civil War, which obviously was a beast, to Secret Wars, to, Blackest Night did well. I mean, a lot of these event comics certainly have exceeded this. But in terms of an ongoing book, a book that is just, on the shelf, and for at least some of it, more issues than not, we're in the 600s, 700s. That's an impressive accomplishment. And it does put Dan Slott in a unique place. But to make this picture look a little bit more sane, I'm going to erase all the titles that exceeded 120,000 copies. Now, why would I do that? Because I want you to look at the curve here. This gives a better sense of what's going on with his run when you take out these crazy spikes. It allows you to look more closely at what's happening here. And what you see is kind of an interesting picture. If you remember kind of where these runs were, and we'll now go through them all, he definitely has kind of the standard drop, but you've been seeing some of these other videos. His drop is not nearly as high as others. He is more stable, at least for the first run, somewhat for the second, and then he starts to lose it in the third and the fourth. But let's go through what this looks like in terms of timeline. So if we kind of shadow out the rest, here's the first run on Amazing Spider-Man. It had average sales of 63,628. And then once you remove these 120,000 copies, then we're at 57,000 on average. That's not great, but you'll see in a moment when I look historically at more things than that, it's on the lower end of what Amazing Spider-Man has done. However, once he did kill off, quote unquote, kill off Spider-Man, things changed. But basically, the adjusted trend over this big time run, he had a 6% increase over the run on this ongoing title from issue 648 to 700. Once again, that's unusual. Right? We don't normally see these increases. You've seen tons of other videos. This is not the normal picture. So that's to his credit. That an increase is an increase, and that's pretty nice. When we did have Doc Ock as Spider-Man, we had average sales of 89,000, so higher. And then after you remove these spike issues, the ones that are bigger, we drop down to 78,000. Now, right away, by the way, you're noticing, you might be picking up on this, that these big issues that spike really high numbers, this is warping the picture quite a bit, and that's an interesting picture. So overall, Superior Spider-Man had a 14% decrease. It's a decrease, but again, Marvel during the same time period was averaging about a 30 to 35% decrease. So Slott was doing better than most. We get into this Amazing Spider-Man #1. The first, true relaunch, Peter Parker's alive. This has average sales of 129,000. That's nice and high. Now, if you remove these 120K comics, we're down to 85. So there you see a very steep decrease once you get rid of these books. But this is where, why I'm showing numbers for both, is I'm trying to show numbers for what the ongoing picture looks like. But when you're putting up so many comics that sell more than 120,000 copies, you can't just write them. I mean, they're part of his run. It wasn't just like one issue spiking it. There were a few in here during the course. There's 15 over the course of his comics. That's not terrible. And in the direct market with no newsstand, sales are sales. So it's good that he's doing that. His trend for this first launch is a 12% decrease. Again, way better than what Marvel is averaging, especially during this time period. Now, keep in mind, we're into, with this, we're into 2014, and generally the numbers are getting worse for Marvel. The trends of their comics, they're relaunching more and they're decreasing more. If you remember the Captain Marvel video, that's definitely what was happening there. So our final bit, this is post-Secret Wars. We see average sales of 94,000. Again, lots of big issues in there, spiking that number up. And this is where, they're getting the biggest impact from those special issues. But they're not just number one. There's issue number, I think, 6 in there is pretty high, issue 15, issue 25. You're seeing a number of issues. Of course, the conclusion to his run did very well. But the average after removing titles that sold over 120K, we're at 60,000. So definitely, this is a much bigger gap, and it gives you an indication of where his run was heading. And of course, here we get his biggest decrease. His trend is now at 26% decrease for an adjusted trend. Even though he had those bigger issues, it was an indication that had he continued on this title, it would have slipped into the 50,000s. It was heading in that direction, and it was really being propped up by these bigger issues. Now, if he could pull off big sales on big events and issues like this within his run, like every 6 months, hey, that would work out. It would be an okay thing, but definitely the trend was starting to get worse. So overall, his entire run, we get average sales of 86,917. For Marvel, that's strong, especially over a course of this amount of time. And if you remove the titles that sold over 120K, it gets worse. You basically lose 20,000, 66,031 is what it nets out to. So is this good or is this bad? Well, for Marvel during this time period, it's good. That's the only way you can probably put it. Normally I say that the issues that spike, the gimmick issues where they spike a big number, it's kind of cheating. However, he did it so frequently that it starts to feel more like a strategy than cheating. For whatever it's worth. Keep in mind, too, we're talking unit sales, and a lot of these bigger issues that sold higher are also priced higher. So he's actually raking in more cash for this as well. So if we looked at the trend line, we get this kind of bumpy road, but more or less mostly flat. I mean, again, we've shown so many of these other sales runs where things just atrophy over time, and Dan Slott actually grew his audience for a period of time, and then it sunk again. And of course, he has that spike up at the end. If we take out the top selling issues, we get, again, a clearer picture of a lot of interest for this, Doc Ock, Superior Spider-Man, and other elements before he gets a pretty steady decrease there toward the end of his run. It felt to me like rebooting it after Doc Ock takes back over. When he rebooted and then they rebooted a second time, that was detrimental. I think this was where Secret Wars, as much as I loved Hickman's Epic there and how it tied out, the relaunches hurt titles. We saw it with Ms. Marvel. We saw it with Captain Marvel. We've seen it with the Avengers. We've seen it with almost everything. The books suffered through that period. So average trend, 8% increase. However, that includes all of these spiked issues. So if you remove those, it's a 9% decrease. All right, 2 different ways to look at this. He had so many high-selling issues that overall his run increased. He can claim to fame that his claim to fame is his trend was higher at the end than when he began. So that's good. However, that trend was also propped up with a lot of special issues. It's true, but he did plan and put those special issues out. So, fair is fair. And still, a 9% decrease is better than just about anyone else working. In fact, probably is better than anyone else working at Marvel at the time in terms of what they were doing with their run. Keep in mind, this was a rough period for Marvel. A lot of relaunches, a lot of reboots. The X-Men are in complete disarray, so it's a weird time. So Slott leaves the book, and in comes Nick Spencer. He started his run July 2018. For what it's worth, this is what the first 12 issues, this first kind of sort of year looks like. The first 12 issues had 104,000 average sales, so a little bit higher, but it was propped up by the first issue for sure. But you'll notice it's fairly flat, an adjusted trend of a 7% decrease. Again, you start to draw the conclusion that maybe Amazing Spider-Man is just one of those books that's going to sell. It's like Batman, and so you can put different people on it and different things will happen. But at least initially, Dan Slott was arguably doing better. Nick Spencer was arguably doing better than Dan Slott. However, a year later, sales were down around 50 to 60,000 on average, about where the title was prior to Dan Slott. So you can start to make an argument that Dan Slott's run overall was stronger. However, it's too early in Nick Spencer, his time on the title, to really draw that conclusion, but you can start to maybe make that picture. Okay, take a deep breath. So very quickly, for some context, how was his title doing before Dan Slott started his run? Well, in the quote-unquote pre-Dan Slott, although keep in mind that 2008-2010, Dan Slott was writing this title. He was just writing it with other people. They were kind of as an ensemble cast that were trading runs. So he was responsible for some of these numbers. But here's what it looks like kind of pre-Dan Slott from 98 to 2010. You see a couple bigger moments in there. Well, one of them was Skredinsky had a really well-received run, especially in 2002, 2003. Aunt May discovers that Peter's Spider-Man, and a couple different things are going on, but we had the 500th issue, which did well. So that's where you see that era is a little bit bigger. And then Civil War in 2006 just helped everything. You've heard me say it. I sound like a broken record, but Civil War just made everything stronger. And that carried over into 2007 when they then decided to erase Peter's marriage, and we get into the Brand New Day era, which was a drop. 2008, 2010, you see it slip from 78,000 down to 54. Pretty steady drop there before Dan Slott comes in. Here's the averages by year of Dan Slott's run. You see 3 years where basically he grows it a little. I mean, like he said, he had that steady growth from 2010 to 2012. He stopped the bleeding. By the way, you may be saying, what's that little star there for 2010? I'm taking just Dan Slott's time on the book since he took over toward the end of 2010. That's what that is. Same thing with 2008. But you then see from 2013, definitely he grows things, and then he gets the title back up. 2017, again, I think Secret Wars really didn't help anything with these reboots. So you see it kind of drop back down to 64,000, but then rise toward the end with that strong finish. And then the Nick Spencer run's looking like this. And I got some numbers from the publisher directly. So, Spencer has the potential to, if he keeps this up and can kind of spike some big things over the next couple of years, if he stays on it, he's doing okay. Okay, so deep breath here. Where does this leave us? I know a lot of people are coming into this video just really wanting to see that Dan Slott's time on this book was abysmal and he was a failure and screw Dan Slott, but that's absolutely not what the numbers show. He can claim to be one of the highest consistent selling Marvel writers over the last 15 years. Now keep in mind, 15 years is a very important number because if you go further back than that, then Brian Michael Bendis has a big claim to fame for a number of things. This picture changes significantly. If you go into the Civil War time period, things start to be very different. But if we're talking specifically over the last 15 years and really over his run, Dan Slott was consistently the best Marvel writer on an ongoing book. Okay, which matters. It wasn't propped up by an event. Amazing Spider-Man had stronger average runs in 2002 to 2003 and 2006 to 2007, but with lower top issues. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is why I separated the numbers earlier for things that were above 120,000 and below. So these runs were overall stronger, but because Dan Slott was putting in these special issues regularly that were selling, well over 120,000, in some cases, up to 500,000, the dollar amount that Slott's bringing in during his run winds up being stronger. Even though the average per issue is higher, these spikes bring in just a ton of money when they happen. Absolutely, the relaunches had diminishing effects to the core line. Very true. However, someone at Marvel, and here's a giant mystery for me. Someone at Marvel figured out a regular bigger issue scheme, and scheme sounds dodgy, but basically somebody figured out that, hey, if we put these bigger issues out in a regular basis, the numbers will spike up and will basically reset the clock for some of this atrophy. We're not just going to only save the big issues in the promotion for issue number 1 or reboots. So why Marvel hasn't used this strategy for other books is a super mystery to me. For whatever reason, Dan Slott on Amazing Spider-Man had a better pattern or a better routine of whenever the sales kind of were settling down a little bit, they do Ends of the Earth, or they do some bigger storyline, Spider Island, and suddenly it would jack up the numbers and they would promote those storylines. They didn't just do this when reboots happened. This is important because this is how the comic industry looked, say, in the 90s and the 80s. You would see people play to storylines to kind of reset the numbers and get things back higher again. The mystery is why this isn't just standard operating procedure for everywhere in Marvel. Why is Amazing Spider-Man doing this just much better? Is it because Dan Slott just knew how to write better to that mechanism? Is it because Tom Brevoort was involved helping? Who knows? Lots of questions here, but for whatever reason, this series did a better job of protecting the drop. Now, close analysis of numbers will drive you insane. They make no sense. When you get really, really close in, like I often do for other titles, you'll see spikes in the middle of an artist's run, meaning like, Ramos will come onto the comic and he'll do 4 issues. And his first and second issue will be pretty average. And then for no apparent reason, the third issue will, add 15,000 copies. And there's no incentive program, there's no overship, there's no like big mystery reveal, somebody gets killed. It makes no sense why some of the smaller spikes happened. It's a mystery. I spent what had to be at least 3 hours looking over each issue, looking at the storyline, pulling them up on Marvel Unlimited, trying to figure out exactly what was going on here for some of these gains. Could never find it. I made multiple calls to folks at Diamond and Marvel to try and understand if there's overships going on here. Nope. It's just weird. Now, had his run continued, we saw the way the trend drop was happening. Had his run continued, it does feel likely that the average sales would have dropped down around 50K or even under. It was headed there for your average issue. So atrophy was absolutely setting in when he left the book. However, he can also claim, honestly, that he had the 3rd highest selling book since 1999, so over 20 years. And if you take away Loot Crate Services, it's the number 2 book. The title that beat it is this Detective Comics anniversary issue. That's it. Star Wars also beat it, but Star Wars was doing some funny math with how it got out there. This issue of Spider-Man that did, over 500,000 copies. He can honestly claim he put up that number, and he can own it. So there you go. There's Dan Slott's Amazing Spider-Man run. It's a complicated picture, and there's definitely more you can go into it. And I'm sure lots of people want to microanalyze this stuff, but just do yourself a favor. If you don't like Dan Slott, that's fine. You can dislike him for his writing, his style, his crazy comments he does on social media, the people he blocks. All that stuff's fair. Fair is fair. You can dislike him for whatever reason you want. But numbers are also numbers. And so please don't embarrass yourself by doing weird mental gymnastics to say, well, but these titles are these titles actually selling to the customers, or is this just a comic shop? The thing is, with a long run like this one, comic shops are not just going to overorder over the course of 6 years. They'd go out of business if they did that. These titles were doing okay. And while there are plenty of back issues of Amazing Spider-Man hanging around, comic shops are not unhappy about Dan Slott's run. If you go talk to your comic shop owner and you say, hey, was this a disaster period for you? They will say no. Dan Slott put a lot of comics in there. It sold a lot of issues. You can certainly make the case that there were variant covers and there was some great art teams assigned to this title. You might even make the argument that, hey, if you put a top tier artist on a book, Ryan Stegman did a big run. Ramos was here. Bacalo was here. There were a lot of really top tier talents on this book. And what do you know? Sales are high. So to be fair, this isn't all Dan Slott. Dan Slott didn't do all of this. It's a full team. There's definitely an artist involved. There could be any number of other people who are involved in helping these books come along. But fair is fair. This run is one of the most successful Marvel has done. All right. So last comment here, you might say, well, this still pales in comparison to the newsstand. Well, yeah, the newsstand definitely had more copies of books out there, but the newsstand also had returnability, and several of these issues were coming back. But definitely, in the days of the 80s in the newsstand, these comics sold more. No doubt about it. They were sold more places. Of course they were sold more. But if you were able to take, and I do have now numbers from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and if you want to look at kind of this bigger picture, I did a quick glimpse at it, what you will find is that Dan Slott's run holds up as being one of the strongest. And you may say, well, wait a minute, how could that possibly be if the newsstand was selling like 200,000 more copies? Well, if you take the distribution, those comics were in way more places. And so if you average out, we've shrunk the market, his run would hold up. Now, that's on Marvel, frankly. That's on the comic industry abandoning the newsstand and selling these comics to a very specific place. That's not on the writer. So there you have it. Love it, hate it. It is what it is. Dan Slott, he definitely can claim some pretty big things. And arguably, it is funny, Brian Michael Bendis often gets the credit for being one of the strongest selling writers at Marvel. I think if you did a side-by-side analysis, you might discover that Dan Slott was a bit more consistent, at least with Spider-Man. He certainly didn't bring it on to Iron Man and Fantastic Four, but at least with Spider-Man, it seemed to work. He was putting out stuff that people wanted. There you have it. How do you like that? Anyway, let me know your questions, your thoughts, and thanks for listening.